I'm going to be talking about the Philistines today, and I really enjoyed this research, and so I hope you will walk away with knowing more about the Philistines that you will ever need to know, and possibly you will have ever wanted to know. But I'm not going to be able to cover all the material concerning the Philistines. It would take a long time, but hopefully I can dispel some myths concerning the Philistines and give a good outline of the Philistines in the archaeological record. To begin with, I want to give a short outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to begin by talking about the Philistines within the biblical context, recapping some of the stories that you have probably already heard that involve the Philistines and maybe didn't know involved the Philistines. And then I'll move on and discuss the historic background and context from which the Philistines came and existed, which is the late Bronze Age. And then I will talk about the possible ethnical boundaries definable through technological, symbolic, cultic, funerary, and dietary aspects of their material culture. And then lastly, we will look at the ongoing research concerning the Philistines. The Philistines are mentioned more than 250 times in the Bible. And a lot of the stories that you've probably already heard and might not know this have to do with the Philistines. They are the primary antagonists of the Israelites in the Old Testament. There are two biblical origin stories, one in Genesis 10:13 and one in Amos 9:7, as well as one in Jeremiah. And the first one in Genesis, they are described as coming from the line of Caslehum, who was from Egypt. But in Amos 9:7 and the passage in Jeremiah, Yahweh claims to have brought the Israelites from Kaftor, which is possibly a Minoan site on the island of modern-day Crete. The Philistines enter the main stage of the biblical narrative in the story of Samson in the book of Judges. Samson's relationship between the Philistines and the relationship with the Philistines is a good mirror to what the relationship between the Philistines and the Israelite was. And that was a very violent one. Samson kills more than 4,000 Philistines in his life. And although it was prophesied that Samson would deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines, every massacre that he caused was not for this purpose, but rather due to a love affair that he had with a Philistine woman, most famous of which was with Delilah. The story goes on, and of course, the story of Samson being betrayed by Delilah, and this is ultimately ends in his death, but he goes out with a bang and brings the temple down on more Philistines. He kills more Philistines in his death than in his life, is what the book of Judges says. Of course, you know the story of David and Goliath, but before the story of David and Goliath is this interesting story of where the Ark of the Covenant is captured by the Philistines and placed in the temple of Dagon. And while in the temple of Dagon, the Philistine priests come in the day after it is placed there and find the statue of Dagon fallen on its face before the Ark of the Covenant, and its head and its hands are cut off, kind of a symbol of Yahweh's dominance over this foreign god. And the Philistines take the Ark of the Covenant out of the temple, but from here on out for the next 6 months until they send the Ark of the Covenant back to Israel, God inflicts them with tumors and hemorrhoids and rats. And while I'm no biblical scholar and can't really, I don't want to interpret this biblical story for you, I think it does reflect that there is not only a political and maybe a racial animosity in the biblical narrative towards the Philistines, but also a religious animosity. And you can see this throughout the even Judaic and Christian depictions of the Philistines. They are really just kind of this primary arch nemesis. I don't know if I could go as far as saying they're kind of the depiction of what is evil, in this iconography, but they are depicted as the enemy, and we can kind of see the biblical bias against the Philistines in this way. But that's the biblical narrative. But who were the Philistines outside of the Bible? In order to begin and look at extra biblical sources, we have to look at the end of the Bronze Age, and before that, at the age of internationalism. The world was being ruled by its first empires during the late Bronze Age. Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, and the Hittites were the first world powers, controlling huge geographical areas that stretched from the Black Sea to modern-day Sudan in Africa, from the Zagreb Mountains in modern-day Iran to Libya. They weren't the first empires. They were the first kind of collection of world empires. And it's known as the Age of Internationalism, and we can really see why it's known as this kind of in the Amarna period, where we find massive quantities of international correspondence between world powers, between Egypt and the Hittites, and Egypt and its vassal states in the Levant and in Cyprus. And it just really displays this massive kind of collusion of trade and international relations. This on the left is a map of the trade routes during the Age of Internationalism, and you can really see that it was that they were very well interconnected, and trade was very widespread. But the Bronze Age, there was a major shift known as the Bronze Age collapse, and it began during the Egyptian Ramesside period. It began for the Hittites after the Battle of Kadesh in 1258 BC, which ironically was when the first written peace treaty was signed. The Hittites suffered from internal power struggles during a time when the Assyrians to the southwest were gaining more and more momentum and control and taking over certain areas of the Hittite Empire. They were able to keep the Assyrians at bay for a while and expand eastwards, but eventually they were even cut off here by the Sea Peoples who weakened their presence in the Levant as well as their rule over Cyprus. Simultaneously at the same time, the Mycenaean civilization collapses in two phases between 1250 BC and 1100 BC. And this collapse, we really don't know what the cause of it was, but it's likely that it was both internal political problems as well as an invasion force. It could be one or the other, but was most likely both, as well as climate change. In talking about the Hittites and the Mycenaean civilization, both were possibly affected by a 150-year drought that lasted from 1250 to the 1100s. And this was discovered by climatologists after comparing a 1972 drought, the Palmer Drought Index of a 1972 drought within this area to every late Bronze Age site from Anatolia to Mesopotamia. And so this would have caused a massive internal problems for the Hittites as well as for the Mycenaeans. And in the south, interesting note on the Mycenaeans is that it's believed that the historical story, while it's a myth, the story of Homer, of the Iliad and the Trojan Wars, while it is a myth, if it had occurred, it would have occurred during this period. The Troy 6th level at the site, at the archeological site of Hisarlik, was destroyed in the 12th century, and it's what scholars believe could have been the Priam's Troy. But this is still speculation, but I think it's very interesting to note. In the south, Egypt's power shrunk drastically during the collapse of the Bronze Age. They faced onslaught from the Libyans and the Berbers from the east, from the west, and onslaught from a coalition of sea peoples from the north. It's also believed by Egyptologists that the Hekla 3 eruption on the island in Iceland occurred during this time, and it was a level 5 eruption. I'm not exactly sure, but I think the most recent eruption on Iceland was a level 3, and that's the one that stopped all of those flights between England and the United States. So this one was a level 5, so it was quite a bit bigger, and very likely could have affected the reign of Ramses III, the climate of that time period. This is when the Philistines kind of first entered the scene. Philistine material culture appears in the Levant in the 12th century BC. And the first etymological connection that we have, extra biblical etymological connection between the Philistines of the Bible and other sources, is in the Minnet Habu temple inscriptions, or temple relief and inscription. This is from the reign of Ramses III, and it depicts the Battle of the Delta. And in it, it says that Ramses III was attacked by a coalition of sea peoples, 6 tribes that joined forces and attacked Ramses III. And of course, Ramses said he won, and he beat them, and he pounded them into dust. But we don't know if this is true. Egyptian writing is, very propagandesque in nature. But a group amongst these sea peoples, the Peliset, the Sheridan, the Weshesh, the Shekles, and the Shikala, and the Dinyan are the 6 peoples listed as this group of sea peoples. And an etymological connection, the first etymological connection between the Philistines of the Bible and extra-biblical sources, is with the Peliset. It's identified as an Egyptian cognate to the word Philistine by Jean-François Chaplon, and it's very interesting. While we don't know if this is actually the Philistines within the Levant, it's likely that this is a cognate between the biblical text, the Hebrew word for Philistine, and the Egyptian word for Philistine. The word we have for Philistine comes from the French, it comes from the Greek, and it means people of Palest. So you can kind of see the connection there. But the sea peoples, the connection between the Philistines of the Levant, I'm going to call them Philistines, but I'm talking about the archaeological Philistines. So try and separate that in your mind between the Philistines of the Bible and the Philistines of the archaeological record a little. The sea peoples appear first in the written record 200 years before Ramses III. The Luki are seen as a sea people, a group of marauding pirates, basically, that kidnap locals from Cyprus and Egyptian villages. And every text concerning the sea people emphasizes the kidnapping of locals. Shelley Waxman, a professor of nautical archaeology at the University of A&M, believes that this is why a list of foreign women were listed in Pylos texts and amongst records of captives. These sea peoples were responsible for the weakening of Hittite power, as I already said. And the most striking link between the Philistines of the Levant and Mycenaean culture is found, the Philistines and the Levant and the sea peoples depicted in the Minnet Habu reliefs is through the boats depicted. It's often believed that the headdresses were specifically Philistine, but while we can be sure that the Egyptians depicted at least one type of clothing that was specific to one of the 6 tribes of the coalition of sea peoples, we can't be sure if it was the Peliset. So the headdresses have often been associated with the Philistines, but they could have easily been the headdresses of the Sheridan or the Weshesh. But we know that it was at least a rendering of, it was true to one of the groups of sea peoples, because Egyptian artists accompanied Egyptian military campaigns as well as trade campaigns. And so one of the boats and one of the types of clothing is true to at least one of the 6 types of sea peoples. The most striking relationship between Philistine material culture and the Minnet Habu reliefs, as well as Mycenaean culture, is that of the bird figurehead. You can see here on the left that the figurehead of the boat is that of a bird head. And the figurehead, if you don't know what that means, if you've ever seen any pirate movie, it's usually the woman at the front of the ship that's made out of wood, that's holding a sword or is very breasty or something like that. Yes, so this figurehead is very, very distinctly Mycenaean, and we know that it was a depiction of at least one of the sea people's types of boats. And Waxman points out that in order for the Luki and the sea peoples to have carried about raids, they would have had to have a specific type of boat, and that would have been a galley. And galleys were oared ships that were very easily maneuverable and quick. And we see galleys appear often in Mycenaean motifs, as well as, and Foxman makes the argument that this is the type of boat that is used in the Minna Abu reliefs. It's fascinating the extent of this type of depiction. It goes as far as it's birds are the most frequent motif in Philistine iconography, and as well as Mycenaean iconography, fish and birds in Mycenae. But the bird motif goes as far is not only represented in kind of Mediterranean areas, but also in the Urnfield culture, which is located in Central Europe and Western Europe. This is a bird-headed boat, bronze bird boat, from the Urnfield culture from the Sams River in northern Mesopotamia. And you can see the resemblance between the bird head on the front of the boat to the bird head of the Minnet Habu reliefs. One of the more exciting finds that relates to the Philistines, relates the sea peoples and this bird figurehead to the Philistines in the Levant, is this fragment of pottery that is late Helladic 3C pottery locally made in the Levant. And it depicts a man standing on top of the figurehead of a boat, which is a bird. You can see the circle with the dot in the middle is the head of the bird, like the duck head, and the line going out would have been the beak of the figurehead. But while this connection is very small between the Philistines and the Levant and the sea peoples, it has been commonly used as the theory, the basis for the theories of the origins of the Philistines. What happened to the sea peoples is usually, in answering that question, people have often say the Philistines settled in the Levant, and that's what happened to the Peleset of the sea peoples. But this is really not based off of fact. In the Papyrus Harris, this theory is based off of what's written in the Papyrus Harris 1, in which it says that the Ramses defeated the sea peoples and took captive the Sheridan and the Weshesh into Egyptian strongholds. And historians believed that the Peleset were with the Weshesh and the Sheridan, and that this was how they were settled in Canaan, because Egypt had a presence in Canaan at the time, and that these strongholds would have been in Canaan rather than Egypt. But the text doesn't say the Peliset were with the Weshesh and the Sheridan, nor that these strongholds were in Canaan rather in Egypt. Did the bird boat in the Menet HaBeluf relief belong to the Philistines, or did it belong to one of the other sea peoples? We don't know, and this brings up the interesting topic of ethnicity. Without diving into the deep waters of this philosophically charged discussion, I'm just going to adopt Anne Killebrews' definition of it, and that is it's a group identity. And that gives us a basis to work off of what the Philistines, what was likely Philistine, and what likely wasn't Philistine, but we can't say that this is fact and this is not. We can say that this is our educated guess. And so there's holes in this definition. And so in order to know who was Philistine, we really need a self-identification to prove that the people of the Pentapolis, which is the 5 cities listed as Philistine in the book of Joshua, we need proof that they are Philistine from the mouth, straight from the horse's mouth, which would be an inscription from one of those cities, and we only have one inscription, and that's from Ekron. And this definition also makes it difficult to define clear cultural boundaries, but it's likely that there weren't many at the time, just like their ethnicity is hard to define today. Another point to jump back to the story of the sea peoples, if the Peliset were really the Philistines, they couldn't have been settled in the Levant after the Battle of the Delta, because the Philistines already existed in the Levant at the time. The Philistine material culture appeared in the 12th century BC, and that was before Ramses III. So this points to a different theory. Maybe they're still related, but it's different. But what's striking about the appearance of the Philistines in the Levant is it was sudden and abrupt, and it was marked by the disappearance of Egyptian material culture in Canaan. You can see these are the stratigraphic results from Tel Mor and Ashdod, and between 5 and 4 levels 5 and 4 in Tel Mor, and between levels 13 and 14 and 13 in Ashdod, Mycenaean ware, which is the first is assumed to be the first Philistine pottery, is marked by the complete disappearance of all Egyptian ceramics. This is a map just to orientate yourself of what we're talking about. The Philistines settled in the on the coast where the 5 cities of Philistia are located, but Philistine material culture is located as far east as the Jordan Valley. Yes. Instead of jumping and comparing Philistine material to Mycenaean and Cyprus material, I'm just going to talk about what we're fairly certain belongs to the Philistines. So we're going to talk about domestic material culture and cultic objects, burial customs, architectural traditions, pottery, and then lastly iconography, where we'll revisit the bird motif. To begin with, the hearths found in
Hearths. H-E-A-R-T-H.
Hearths.
Mm-hmm.
Correct me afterwards.
Okay.
Are believed to be used for domestic purposes, but were likely multifunctional. They appear in early Iron Age Philistine sites that are different, and they are different from Canaanite Israelite settlements. While they had hearths, they were different in design from Israelite hearths. They could have been used for religious and communal or cooking practices, but one of the most, Anne Killebrew believes that the Philistines were actually colonialists from Cyprus, and so her big takeaway from the hearths is that they are closely related to Cyprus hearths in style rather than Greek hearths. And the origin stories are that the Philistines were migrated from Mycenae, from Greece, after the temple destruction phase, and that they were basically refugees from Mycenae. That's been what's been believed generally, and is now less accepted. And Killebrews' theory is that they came from Cyprus, but there are other theories that they came from Anatolia or from Crete. We really don't know where they came from, but we do know what is distinctly them in the Levant. And this was one of my favorites, and these are bathtubs, and they were previously believed to have had a unspecified domestic use, but primarily they were thought to have been used for cultic cleansing. And they don't appear anywhere else in Canaan. These types don't appear anywhere else in Canaan. And the bathtubs were believed to be used for cultic cleansing because they were found in throne rooms, sanctuaries, and bathrooms. Rarely in bathrooms. And they were rarely found in situ. They are made of stone or clay and are usually installed on stone slab floors. And aside from the theory of cultic cleansing, Laura Muzoa has what I find a more interesting theory of their use, and that is that they were used for industrial purposes rather than cultic purposes. She proposes that they were used for the scouring and felting of wool. And if you don't know what that is, I didn't either. The scouring of wool is the process of washing wool after it's been sheared off the sheep. It's if you've ever touched a sheep, it's really, really oily and really dirty. So they have to wash it in hot water to get this oil out. And they scour wool so that they can felt it. And the process of felting is that they take the wool and they apply pressure and heat to the wool so that the microscopic hooks on the ends of the hairs hook and fuse together. It's like Velcro. You know, on one side of Velcro there's the loop, and on the other side there's a hook. And when you put Velcro together, the hooks hook in the loops, and when you tear it apart, you tear the hooks out of the loops, and that's what the process of felting is. And Anne Killebrew points that this kind of bathtub and this usage of these bathtubs appeared on the island of Cyprus. These bathtubs were often found next to large clusters of loom weights. And these loom weights were used to weigh down fabric of vertical looms. You can see here in this illustration, this is a much more recent loom, more modern loom. I think it's an Icelandic loom. But the loom weights would be tied to the bottom and weigh down the fabric so that the weaver could weave from the top down. And these were found in, these are usually not fired, so they would have just been made and then applied. Yes. Another interesting find is the incised cow scapula. And these did not exist in the Levant prior to the early Iron Age, and several were found in Ashkelon and Ekron, as well as Tel Dor. I don't know if I listed the 5 cities, the Pentapolis, in Joshua, but they are Ekron, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gaza, and Gath. So these cow scapulas were found at 2 Pentapolis sites, Ashkelon and Ekron, as well as Tel Dor. We don't know what their function was, but they could have been used for divination rituals, or could have been a part of an instrument. None are found in Mycenaean culture, but several bovine scapula, appear in late Cypriote 3A sites. One of the most famous Philistine objects is the Ashtoda, named after the city of Ashdod, where the only one has been found. It is a seated female figure, or a seated female figure, and only one intact Ashtoda has been found. It's believed to have been Anatolian in origin, and thus was believed to have been interpreted as the mother goddess Kubaba. However, it should really be viewed as a hybridization of Aegean, Anatolian, and Cypriote styles. However, they were believed to be stylistically linked, according to Trude Dotan, to the lamenting figures of Mycenaean cultures. This was primarily, you can't see it in this one illustration, but it's primarily because of the style of the head of the Ashtoda. But there is really no link to the lamenting figures, no strong link to the lamenting figures, and but a closer stylistic parallel is to the seated figures from Mycenae, which you can see at the bottom. Yes. It's possible that these seated goddesses depicted are the seated goddess that is the Ashtoda is also depicted in a wall relief in Nimrud. This is believed by David bin Shimlo, who wrote a book on Philistine iconography, and he says that it's possible that in this wall relief of the loot from Gaza, that this one in the middle it could possibly be the same goddess as represented by the Ashtoda. Whether or not this is true, we don't know, but it's a theory. Up until the 2000s, it was believed that the anthropoid clay coffins found at Tel Beth Shin and Tel El Farah, which you can see in the picture at the bottom, belonged to the Philistines. This was primarily linked to the Philistines due to the parallels between the headdresses on the clay coffins and those of the sea peoples depicted in the Midnat Habu relief. You can see the styles, and the link is, it's to be noted that there is a similarity between the headdresses, but like I already said, the Egyptian artist could have been depicting any one of the 6 tribes of the sea peoples. It's not widely accepted that they are Philistine coffins anymore, primarily due to the lack of evidence. It could have easily been depicting Egyptians. These clay coffin burials aren't found in any of the Pentapolis sites, and they are associated primarily with Egyptian outposts in Canaan. There had been no genuine Philistine burial grounds found at any of the Pentapolis sites until 2013, and the findings have yet to be published. This was the Leon Levy expedition at Ashkelon, and the co-director of the dig said that they found exactly what they had hoped to find. What that means, we don't know, but we are excited for it. Let's talk about architecture. Philistine architecture is very interesting. In his dissertation, Adam Ajah observes that there is no formalized housing plan for Iron Age Philistine cities. They have no distinct arrangement of neighborhoods and houses. However, 4 elements are reoccurring in Philistine domestic architecture, and that is integrated vertical brick bond patterns, which I'm just going to refer to as IVB patterns, axial pillars, multi-purpose vestibules, and a linear arrangement of room access. IVB bond patterns were stacked like this illustration. However, they were stacked like this illustration. They lacked durability and were only used for interior walls. And it was likely that they were used for interior walls because they lacked durability, and the architects knew this. Why they were used, we don't exactly know, but it could have been for multiple reasons. It could have been for aesthetic purposes, but that's less likely than the theory that they were used for economic purposes. IVB bond pattern walls would have been protected by the horizontally placed bricks or vertically placed bricks, and would have protected the inner layer of bricks, and would have conserved building materials. Axial pillars, represented as these black dots in the centers of these rooms, these filled in black dots, were roof supporting pillars that stood in the center of the room. And there's only one case where there are more than one pillar in a room. They were not used as room dividers, and this was likely to optimize space. Installations such as baths and hearths were often found built next to these axial pillars. And they were constructed usually something like this. Despite the variety of domestic constructs, one element remains standard, and that is the multi-purpose vestibule. This is a term coined by Adam Aja to define a workroom that is consistently located in the periphery of the house. He says, quote, often the room is placed adjacent to the exterior street or alley, and it contained numerous built installations. These included fire pits, bread ovens, work platforms, and sunken vessels, among others, although the selection of installations was not consistent between structures. So this was basically kind of a garage with a workroom that consistently showed up in every house, every kind of entrance of the house from the street or exit into the street. Lastly, one of the key elements to Philistine architecture is the construction of the rooms along a linear pattern. Aja observes that this is often coupled with a single axial pillar. A through D represent typical domestic quarters, and E through G are what Aja calls elaborate style of linear houses. And it's very important to note that while the Philistine domestic architecture is very unique to the Levant, and there are no four-room houses, which are usually associated with Israelites. But there are no four-room houses constructed within any of the Pentapolis sites. I won't describe the typical outlay of Philistine temples because, as far as I know, only one temple has been identified as truly Philistine, and that's the temple of at Ekron, where the royal dedicatory inscription was found, which is the first text identified as Philistine, and kind of the only text really identified as Philistine. There's also possibly another Philistine temple located at Tel Kassil, but it's but we're not exactly sure. We haven't found any inscription. However, both temples have a distinctly Phoenician style, which is the same kind of temple that was built on the island of Cyprus. The Ekron inscription is written in the Phoenician alphabet. It is the closest link to the Philistine language and is written in a Phoenician dialect that also appears in inscriptions in the northern city of Byblos, which is not a Philistine site. The inscription says, "The temple which he built, Caius, son of Padi, son of Yasid, son of Adda, son of Yair, ruler of Ekron, for Patiah, his lady, may she bless him and protect him and prolong his days and bless his lands." Other text fragments were found at Ekron, but this is the only one large enough to contain complete sentences. The goddess listed where it says for Patiah, his lady, is the topic of much debate because it's missing the third letter. If the letter is rendered a resh, an R, then it could be Pidre, the Semitic daughter of Baal. While books upon books have been written on Philistine ceramics, I'm going to avoid this whole black hole and only make a few points regarding the influences on Philistine ceramics. We can't say the ceramics of the Philistines were an ethnical marker, because like most of us, just because we have IKEA ware at home doesn't mean we're Swedish. So pottery typology can't define ethnicity, but it can tell us what material influences were placed upon a culture and where they came from. For example, Mycenaean influence is the strongest influence on oh, we did this already. The Mycenaean influence is the Aegean influence is the strongest on Philistine pottery. Certain kitchenware, such as bowls, craters, and stirrup jars, are often distinctly related to Aegean prototypes. The forms and styles are an early Philistine material culture, almost identical to Aegean-style pottery, but petrographic results prove that Mycenaean 3 C1b bowls were made in the Levant, were locally made, and therefore are distinct from late Hellenic 3C prototypes. You can see the forms and the motifs are similar, very, very similar between late Hellenic 3C and Mycenaean 3C. Secondly, jars, cylindrical jugs, and cooking pots are very closely related to late Cypriote 3C and 3A pottery, more so than they are to Mycenaean pottery. It's important to observe that Philistine cooking pots represented a complete break from a millennium-long tradition of Canaanite cooking pots. This doesn't sound very exciting, but it gives us more evidence that the Philistines arrived in the Levant through some sort of migration. Having said that, it is important, while Canaanite-style pottery is occasionally found in Philistine sites, there are fewer crossovers between Philistine and Canaanite-style pottery than there are between Mycenaean and Cypriote pottery. They were more influenced by outside sources rather than local relations. It's usually assumed that while ceramics is no indicator of ethnic identity, kitchenware closest reflects the everyday characteristics of certain groups. Cultic material is more easily influenced due to its closer link to the international scene, but I want to point out one set of ceramic vessels that reflect a different influence not seen in Philistine kitchenware, and that is the lion-headed cups. The lion-headed cups were previously thought to be related to the Mycenaean Rita cups that were used for libation practices. However, L. Meiberg discredits this theory, linking the lion-headed cups to those of an older Anatolian tradition that dates back to the Assyrian colonial period. This is one of the rare occasions that lions appear in Philistine iconography. On the left are lion-headed cups from Philistine sites, and on the right, these are from Ugarit, which is northern Levant, and Alalach, which is central Syria. Yes. So let's talk a little bit about iconography. Like I already said, the bird motif seems to have been the most important in Philistine iconography. We have already seen its presence in depictions of the sea peoples, as well as an example from the Urnfield culture in that Urnfield bronze bird boat that I showed at the beginning. It appears not only on pottery, but also in rattles, bird bowls, and terracotta birds. It is likely, as well as carinoi, which are funny objects, but they are Greek in style. It often represented the presence of a goddess in Minoan and Mycenaean cultures, and easily could have also in Philistine culture. But no one seems to know exactly which goddess was represented. It could have represented the Philistine god of Asherah, but we really don't know. There are three gods in the Bible that are listed as primarily Philistine, and it's Dagon, Asherah, and one other that I can't remember. But the fish motif is very present in Mycenaean and Cyprus pottery, and is usually associated with, while not in Mycenaean and Cyprus, but in Philistine, in the Philistine land, in Philistia, it's usually associated with the male deity Dagon, who is one of the gods I already listed. Human motifs are very rich in diversity, but are very rare. There are a lot more animal motifs than there are human ones. And the few representations of humans are on male terracotta, such as the or female terracotta, such as the Ashtoreth, and they also appear on cultic stands and very rarely in glyptic and pottery decoration. These are heads from various figurines found at Ashdod and Ashkelon, and this is one of the very few, I'm already there, very few pottery paintings that depicts a human. You can see it. This is the human head, and he's holding a cup, and behind him he's flanked by a bird, and behind the bird is a dolphin, and a dolphin diving into the water. We can tell it's a dolphin from the head of a dolphin on the reverse side. Most Philistine objects from the Iron Age should be considered a hybrid of Egyptian, Aegean, and Canaanite style. So this part is a little tricky, and is a huge debate, and became a huge debate in the 1980s. And the original idea was that we could determine who was Israelite and who wasn't through animal remains found at archaeological sites, and if there was the presence of pig bones, then we could say that it wasn't Israelite because the Israelites were forbidden to eat pork in the Levitical law, but also that if they did eat pork, they were Philistine. This is, I don't want to go into the debate of whether or not we can say who was Israelite and who wasn't, but I want to point out the consistent percentage of pig bones found throughout the Iron Age in the Pentapolis sites. So you can see here, this is the late Iron Age when the Philistines would have first arrived in the Levant. And this is the Pentapolis. And more pork is being consumed in the north by likely Canaanites. But it is still, the pork consumption is still in the lower percentages of being consumed. This is possibly because it was a tradition that was brought with the Philistines. But it's what's more distinct and more striking is the large amount of pig bones at Philistine sites during the early Iron Age. This could be because Philistines used it as a ethnic marker, that they identified as Philistines and were therefore pork eaters. We don't actually know this, but we do. This percentage is striking, so we can say that something was happening. But during the Iron Age 3, the pork consumption in the Pentapolis sites shrunk drastically, and this is likely because of the enculturation of the Philistines within Canaanite tribes. The Philistines reached the height of cultural development under the Assyrians, but the last Philistine city of Ekron fell to the Babylonians in 605 BC. This is when the Philistines disappear from the Levant completely. True to Dotan concludes that the disappearance of the Philistines is due to the deportation of many after the Babylonian invasion, as well as the long-term enculturation of the Philistines through Assyrian, Israeli, and Phoenician influences. The final echo of the Philistines can be heard in the second half of the 5th century BC in toponyms from the Murashu archives from Nippur. They point to an ethnic self-identification among the exiles in Babylon, who were listed by the name of a local region, Ishkalunu, Ashkelon. With this, the Philistines disappear from the pages of history. This has just been a brief look into what we know concerning the Philistines so far, but the research is far from over. There are still ongoing digs at Philistine sites such as Tel Es-Safi. Finds from Timnah Valley should shed some light on the environment of the Iron Age Canaan, and the results from the 30-year Leon Levy expedition at Tel Ashkelon have yet to have been published. We know that they found 150 burials at Ashkelon in oval-shaped graves, with a few being buried in ashlar chamber tombs and 4 being cremated. These burials were very uncommon in Canaan, and the expedition proved that the Philistines were not uncultured barbarians as they have always been viewed, but were highly cultured and very involved in international trade. They also found a marketplace, which I think is probably more interesting than the cemetery, which also proves that they were highly involved in trade. Archaeologists took DNA samples from the skeletons in the cemetery for archaeogenetic population analysis. Hopefully through this they will be able to draw a stronger link between either Cyprus, Mycenaean civilization, Crete, or Egypt, and we can finally figure out, come up with a stronger hypothesis of the origin of these Philistines. And that's all I've got.